Well, we're here today with Lisa Szutiak. Lisa is a clinical psychologist. Her and her family attend our church here and been part of our congregation for a number of years. And so I asked Lisa to come and join me here and so that we could talk about family and what this coronavirus and isolation particularly is doing to family and the effect that it can have on family. One of the things that we want to start with is Lisa works a lot with children and with marriages, but does a lot of work with children. And what are some of the things that children are dealing with and the challenges that they're dealing with the isolation, being off school, the uncertainty, and all of the things that are going on in their little minds right now? What can you share with us about that?
Most of us imagine that kids are really looking forward to having more sleep-ins and more holidays. What's happening is actually the opposite of that. What's happening for kids is they're away from their routines. They're uncertain about what's happening in the world, and depending on their age, probably have access to quite a bit of information that's unsettling and lots of uncertainty for everybody. So the same things that adults are feeling, for kids, depending on their ages, it's really difficult for them to process, and then they have emotions attached to all of those things.
So, as a parent, you're a parent, I'm a parent. What are some of the
Absolutely.
things we should be watching for in our kids right now?
I think it's important to watch for any major changes. So if you have a child that's usually fairly outgoing, and at this point, maybe they're sleeping a lot and they're kind of spending most of their time in their room and not interacting a lot, I think we need to pay attention to those things and invite them out and interacting because they are feeling very isolated. The other piece is their peer relationships are really important. And for some, those aren't ongoing at this point. A lot of times kids will interact a lot at school, but in activities. So they've kind of lost layer after layer all at once. So when we make one change, it has a net effect. But when you add change on top of change, so they're at home with their families and having a lot of quality time, which can be both a happy experience, but also a stressful experience because we're not used to having 24/7 contact with
Right.
each other. So that can be a bit challenging. And again, that peer contact piece is so important. They have a lot of interaction and humor, and whether they're a participant or an observer, so quieter kids, they might not interact directly as much when they're at school, but they're still in the presence of a lot of activity.
Right.
So they're getting to absorb some of those humorous experiences or the organization of things with other kids as an observer
Yeah.
as well.
So as kids go through this almost withdrawal from their peer
Absolutely.
groups, it's important for us to be able to help them somehow reconnect, whether it be phone
Absolutely.
calls or maybe Zoom or Skype or something. And so as we go through this and we spend more and more time apart, children are going to face this even stronger because right now we're kind of a week and a half into it,
Absolutely.
2 weeks into it, depending on when they went off school, and spring break was coming, but spring break didn't end up being the way we expected spring break to be.
Exactly.
But this is probably going to go on for a few more weeks at least.
Yep.
As we go further into this, is there some things that parents can do to, other than saying get out of bed, are there's some things that we can do as parents to help our kids adjust in this circumstance?
So I think the first thing that's really important is we keep trying to communicate with our kids. And for some of us, that's a little bit challenging because we're used to being really busy and having a whole bunch of things going on. So we're kind of communicating on a need be basis. Right now, we have lots of space and time to do that. And I guess that's one of the nice things is this is an opportunity to start to grow that communication process with kids and parents. Because I think sometimes when we come into an experience like this, where we have a lot of time together, we're more aware of how difficult it is to connect and communicate, or how much space we've lost over time, just because of development and busyness and a whole bunch of other factors that kind of keep our families on the run and unable to spend kind of long periods of time together.
Right.
And for teens, part of the developmental challenge is independence. So they're, trying to find ways of depending less on parents and figuring some things out for themselves. So that's an important group to reach into, because they tend to isolate and really focus on peer relationships when things are just going ordinarily along. So when there's a big change like this, I think it's harder to engage them, and we have to make more of an intentional effort, because they're less likely to come out and seek
Right.
parents and the siblings together.
Yeah.
It's challenging. A lot of people are thinking, well, they have their brother or sister to spend time with, but it's not the same as being with peers. And then it's hard for families, because the kids might, be tired of being in the house and on each other's nerves a little bit. And so it helps to, I guess, for parents to have a discussion with kids about giving each other some space.
Right. So now they're out of their routine. They've lost their
Absolutely.
kids, lost their friends, their peer group, as far as being in close contact with them. Some, like you said, are more shy or more reserved or stand back,
Yeah.
but they still get to observe and interact with what's going on around them, but they've lost that. Before this even happened, our children were going more to their phones than they were to talking in person with people.
Absolutely.
Even when they were with people, they were talking to somebody else with their phone. So now their life is pretty much restricted to their phone. Do you have any ideas or thoughts about how to encourage them to get off their phone, or how to encourage families of setting up some type of routine for kids to be able to follow, since their routine has just been devastated?
Absolutely. So I think as we're working through this process, there'll be more opportunities for kids to engage with some of the learning pieces, and perhaps with some of their peers that way as well. So the routine piece is really important. I don't think it's a bad thing for kids to get a little bit more sleep. So maybe not to be woken up at 6:30 in the morning just because that's their routine. So starting a little bit later is fine. But then kind of having an organization to the day, so that they're working on, they're going to have work that they can do that will be provided through their teachers, probably ultimately. So we can encourage some of that connectedness, but also trying to have some times in between where we connect as a family. So doing a game or something that we can interact with together, that's not just task oriented. So it's, let's clean the house all together, doesn't really get their attention or help them to want to communicate
Doesn't
more.
make my kids very excited. No.
No. So being able to do some things like maybe playing a game, and planning and predicting things. So kids are hearing what's happening in bits and pieces on the news and social media. They're talking about their fears with each other, and they don't have a lot of life experience in terms of how to cope with things well. So keeping an open dialogue about what's happening, and keeping in mind the age of the child. So younger children, you want to speak more in generalities, talk a little bit about how they feel. Older kids and teenagers, they're probably getting some information on social media or TV or whatever. So a little bit more in-depth conversation
So
with
as
them.
a parent, then, I guess it does go by the child, but how do we keep our kids from allowing fear and anxiety to rise because of this? It's the communication piece as parents, I guess, with the children, to help them to understand what's going on, but not be overwhelmed by what's going on. So as a parent, for me and my two girls, they're teenagers. I've been telling them, yes, this is going on. My oldest, as soon as this started happening, she started following it on all the news feeds. And then as soon as school got canceled, she stopped following it. And I said, are you watching too much of this? And she said, no, I only watched it just to know when school was going to be canceled. So that was her biggest concern. Okay, school's canceled. I don't need to know what's going on in the world
Wow.
anymore. But so how far do we take our kids down this road? As far as talking to them about what's going on? Because I know it can create fear and anxiety in their life. Do you have any kind of boundaries you think we should try to set in our homes for this?
Well, I think it depends on the age of the child, first of all. So younger children, you don't want them in the presence of a lot of discussions on TV or news that they're not really going to understand kind of what that means.
Right.
So the older kids, because they understand what's going on and they have access in kind of multimedia settings, I think you can have a little bit deeper conversation. The other thing is, as adults, we don't necessarily have all the answers right now, but we can certainly talk about how the information that we're receiving is affecting us, and that we're working through it together step by step. So one of the problems that happens for people is they kind of reflect on something that they've gone through that was difficult in the past, and they get lost in those old feelings and emotions and fears, or they start to locate themselves in the future. Well, what if this happens? Well, what if the worst case scenario unfolds over time? So as we get lost in the past and in the future, we have to come back into the present, because that's where we can regulate our emotions better.
Right.
So being able to do some breathing exercises with your kids. So if you're finding that they're really stressed out, to take some breaths and then be able to come back into the moment, which would be sort of like a mindfulness piece. And that really just involves bringing back the senses into that moment. So it's having them describe something that they remember, like a family vacation moment, as an example. And it's having them remember the sights, the smells, the textures of things, the colors, everything that was happening, so that they're focusing on a visual memory, even a picture if you have a picture, but just coming back into those moments that we can engage all our senses. It gives the brain an opportunity to kind of reset.
Right.
And then it helps us to regulate some of those intense emotions that we're having.
Well, Paul even tells us that in Scripture, where he says, think on whatever is pure, whatever is noble, whatever is good, think on these things, for us to focus our mind. And it is a responsibility for us to help our kids do that, to think on the good things, not just allow their mind to go to that worst case scenario.
Absolutely.
Even for our spouses. So we've talked a little bit about children. Let's move to mom and dad. We're all facing a number of things, whether it be our work, not knowing what's going to happen, or maybe we've already been laid off, finances, and then worry about our children's education. We have so many things right now that are bombarding our mind. It can become overwhelming.
Absolutely.
I'm going to talk about in my message about putting our faith in the Lord and prayer, and we know that is the foundation for everything. But then there's some physical things that we really should be doing to help our families right now, mentally, as far as communicating with our wife, communicating with our husband or our spouse. Just maybe talk about some things that we can do as spouses to help each other through this.
Sure. I think one of the challenges is people are busy, and a lot of that busyness that we get wrapped up in, it takes us away from each other. So right now we have intense each other moments. So I think it's important to have time and space as an individual just to regroup. So when we're affected by news or just changes that are happening in our household, a lot of people are facing job change, working in different ways or not working. So there's multiple layers of stressors and newness that we're trying to cope with. So it's just remembering, I guess, to keep regrouping through all of that. And we can do some of that. As Christians, we're able to spend time in prayer, and that helps us to sort of refocus and see that there's a bigger system at work with God and His support of us through all of this, right? I think with each other, it's trying to be patient and over communicating in some ways. We're always busy and, quick messages and moving here and there. Right now, we're all kind of together. So it's trying to be patient and do some of that over communicating, not assuming that the other person knows what we mean when we say something. Or what we're seeing with kids too is they express their emotions maybe not directly. So you might see a moodiness or maybe a shift from a good mood into a sad mood more suddenly than would be a regular experience for that child. So trying to pay attention to some of those pieces. And as spouses, we're operating in different ways. We have more time together and more time in each other's space in non-traditional ways. So it's number one, trying to be patient, but also communicating how you feel and what you need to each other. And a little bit of space in small ways goes a long way. So if we're feeling just frustrated with the newness of what we're experiencing all together in our small spaces in our homes, just taking some time to take some breaths, to say some prayers and talk to God a little bit in those moments, and then come back to each other kind of in a refreshed, calmer, less reactive kind of way.
For the homes that have mom and dad both there, they can tag team off a little bit. And one can help with the children at one time and the other can have their own space and family time. For the mom or the dad that's home alone with their kids, any thoughts for them to how to reset themselves in the middle of all of this when everything just seems to be coming at them? Any thoughts for them at this time?
Well, it's interesting because when we think about calming down because we're upset about something, we think of that as a big process. The nervous system actually only needs a few minutes to kind of reset. So it's about going away somewhere, and even if it's the bathroom with the closed doors is your 2 minutes, it's starting with some breaths, and it's a deep breath through the nose and then out through the mouth. So it's making sure that we're not almost hyperventilating, because sometimes when we're stressed, we take small, short breaths, and that has a negative effect on our bodies. So it's just taking some time to take some deep breaths in and out, and then just to regroup a little bit. So in the same way that mindful piece for children is really helpful, and that's the coming into the moment and maybe describing something or discussing something that takes us away from worry, parents need to be doing that for themselves as well. It's kind of like taking a moment to regroup, and we do that through breath, and we do that through sort of refocusing and trying to separate. I think the other thing is we get caught up in big planning rather than just in living in the moment. So it's the what can I do for the next hour with my kids, not how are we going to get through the next week. It's cutting it into smaller pieces and including some activities that we maybe wouldn't have had time or the inclination to do before. Some old school things like playing some games, because I think kids especially are really used to kind of refocusing in electronics, and that kind of takes us away from each other. So we need to have them have that space and time with the methods that they're comfortable with, but then we can have breaks with that by interacting in some new ways. So maybe doing a game or drawing together, or looking at some funny memes together, or something that can connect us but doesn't separate us in our kind of electronics-focused world.
Yeah. So we've talked about a few different things, from parents to kids. Anything that I haven't asked that you just feel in your heart, that you would want to encourage families today, that you would say, hey, focus and I love the point of live in today. Don't live in the past, and don't live too much in the future other than hey, you know God's going to get us through this. But live in today. I love that. Take some time to yourself. Notice when the child is going silent or just being more drawn back. Take some time to stop and talk with them and find out where they're at, find out what they're thinking. Anything else that you would try to encourage families today, that these are things that to get us through this next little while, some things that we need to make sure that we are focusing on?
So I think it's really important to extend patience both to our kids but to ourselves as well. So giving ourselves permission to take a moment and catch our breath and regroup, because there's so much emotion that everybody's experiencing, and we never really know when that's going to get triggered. So it could be a conversation that our kids have with each other. It could be something that comes on the news. It could be changes that are happening in our city right now, like people lining up outside of shops and, having to stand in distance in lineups. And there's lots of visual kind of stressing cues that are happening. So we carry all of that with us. So it's being able to take lots of time to regroup. And when we have a faith, we're so lucky to have the faith process that we do to lean into.
Yeah.
I think sometimes people are hard on themselves because they expect themselves to stay steady in that belief and that okayness through all moments. And I think that God, better than anyone, understands what it means to be human.
Yeah.
And how we come in and out of okayness. So we need to give ourselves permission to regroup and to talk through things and to have quiet moments where we can just catch our breath and reflect on things so that we can support each other. It's hard for everybody, adults and kids alike, because we're in very different territories. And lots of us have talked about how great it would be if we had all this time together. Relationships being as wonderful and complex as they are, there's some interesting challenges involved with lots of time together too, and especially because a lot of times we're used to connecting in activities and we're restricted right now. So maybe we're a family that goes to the park lots or goes on walks or does physical activity. It's challenging when you're just in your home trying to do some of those things. So I guess part of it is giving ourselves permission to be creative and doing some things we haven't done. So if we haven't ever had the time to do a craft or share a story or look at some old photos together, that we haven't had time to remember some of those amazing things that have happened. And that also helps us to connect to the things that are going to happen in the future that are exciting and positive. I mean, part of this is the uncertainty that we feel, but there's also positive pieces coming out of some of this. For a lot of us, it's giving us a chance to refocus and regroup and to be grateful for our health and our time with our families, and in some ways in getting to know each other in a little bit different way, because we have all this sort of enforced quality time that we usually don't have. So it's being able to connect in some new ways, and in some ways maybe get to know each other in a deeper way and connect in a deeper way. And some of that can be through prayer and through having moments where we share our fears and our hopes and our dreams, and start to embrace some of the changes, things that can actually grow us in some ways. It's not often that we have time to just take a pause. Most people are busy or worrying about how they're going to do certain things or financial concerns or whatever. This is a time when those things aren't completely suspended, but when we can try and be together in different ways. And humor has such a healing impact. So it's and we have more access if we're not by nature particularly humor oriented. There's funny memes, there's all kinds of pictures and different things that we can engage in with our kids that can give us back a smile and just a moment where we can forget that there's lots happening in the world.
That's
around us.
that's probably a neat one. That I mean, our kids know the internet better than we do, especially if
Absolutely.
they're a little bit older. And maybe something for families to do every day is, all right, who's going to bring the humor today? Who's going to line up the
Absolutely.
humor for us? And it's your turn today to find the humor for all of us to engage in today. So my wife is the one that finds humor. Last night
Nice.
she did something and literally laughed so hard that I almost fell over. But and that's not me. I'm not the. I laugh inside mostly.
Yeah.
Uh, but afterwards, if, it's funny you bring it up. Afterwards, I actually felt a whole lot lighter in my spirit. That I just
Absolutely.
laughed and laughed hard, and then I was like, "Oh, I feel better." So, yeah, maybe families, as you look at your life and as you look at where you're at and what is going on around you and what God is doing, don't forget to look for the positive. Don't forget to look for what God is doing. Bring some humor into your family. Let the kids be maybe in charge of that, or whoever the funniest person in your house is, be in charge of that. Take some turns doing it. We hope that this has been helpful to you, and hope that as you go through this, that you know you're not alone, that there are people out there to help you. Don't let yourself be isolated, and make sure that you reach out to friends. Make sure you reach out to your church, whether you're from our church or another church and watching this. Reach out to your church. Reach out to your spiritual family, and allow them to be a word of encouragement to you today. God bless you, and we look forward to seeing you in person again sometime soon.